Hey guys, I have just spent a good amount of time trying to figure out what I did with your syllabus, but apparently I skipped this week on your syllabus. I'm so sorry. I have no idea why. I went from August 23rd to September 7th. This week does exist. We are actually, somehow we got a week behind on this. And so we're gonna have one video lecture this week. I thought that we had two. Anyway, we're just gonna have one this week. And then we will be back on track next week to what your syllabus says. Today we're gonna do the politics of the American founding. Next week we'll do federalism and the United States Constitution. And your syllabus has our first quiz next week. That is kind of depending on where folks are with Blackboard access and textbooks. I know we've had a lot of problems with that. Everything should be resolved right now. I've talked to all of your schools, and it seems like everybody should have Blackboard access right now. If somehow you're watching this and you don't have Blackboard access, email me and we'll see what's going on. But everybody should have Blackboard access right now, and everybody should have their text. From what I understood, all of your schools had the text from previous years that I've taught this. So I think they all still have it on hand. It seems like some are still making you purchase that, but hopefully that will be taken care of soon. Please be caught up with your reading. Your syllabus, just be caught up through the week of August 17th and week of August 23rd as of the end of this week. Last week we did not get to the politics of the American founding. We're going to get through that today, and then we'll be caught up. And then next week we will have just one lecture on federalism and the United States Constitution, and hopefully your first quiz. But stay tuned. Also, next week, do not expect your first lecture Monday morning, since Monday is a holiday. I'll probably record Monday evening and then post it Tuesday morning. So email me if you have any questions, but I know everybody's out of school on Monday anyway, so I didn't want to make you do that. All right, politics of the American founding. Our governments depend for their authority on people believing that their power is legitimate. So when that legitimacy is challenged, so is their authority. In 2016, I'm a lobbyist, and most of what I do is represent clients in Nevada, actually. So this is kind of applicable to what I do right now, but the textbook actually talks about Cliven Bundy in 2016. He organized Citizens for Constitutional Freedom, which was a response to divine instruction to take over a wildlife refuge in Oregon and some in Nevada. He was supporting ranchers, and they were arrested for arson on federal land, but those ranchers maybe didn't support Bundy's group, but Bundy demanded the land be given back to the state. It was owned by the federal government, who didn't want to cause a showdown. Various militias joined the effort. Most ended up surrendering, and it ended up after about almost 2 months. It was a disaster. It was a crazy, crazy time. But it reflected a growing movement that the federal government is abusing the power of the Constitution, and that the power must be returned to the citizens. That was a movement in 2016, and we still are seeing some of that today. I think probably the bloodiest incident of that is in 1995, the Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City bombing. But how should the federal government respond to challenges against its legitimacy? Where do we draw the line between sounding off against elected officials and someone who actually advocates for violence to protest? That's kind of a rhetorical question, right? So let's talk about our founding a little bit. A lot of British subjects came to America to make money and to practice religion without interference and to become landowners. But England was on the brink of a change and beginning to think that monarchs didn't rule by divine right. They started favoring increasing power of Parliament at the expense of the kings, and that individuals are citizens and not subjects. But folks still came here searching for that. A useful way to understand who had power in the colonies is to look at the rules regulating political participation. That is, who was allowed to vote in colonial lawmaking bodies, who wasn't, and why. Each colony had its own voting rules based on religion, property, and gender and race. In the earliest colonial days, the tightest requirements for voting were moral or religious qualifications. The northern colonies wanted to keep the ungodly out of the government. In 1640, the religious test for voting prevented 3/4 of Massachusetts' population from having any political power. But by 1691, they moved closer to Virginia's view that based worth on wealth instead of character, which also still not quite there yet. Property, conventional British wisdom was that if you're not a property owner, you don't care about the government anyway, right? The colonies began to think that this was, they started thinking this way too, actually, and they required that voters be property owners or later just taxpayers. One Women could sometimes vote in England if they satisfied the property requirement and there were no other voting males in their household. Widows, daughters who had inherited property, etc., could vote in church meetings. This was eventually excluded in America after the Revolution, and women had to fight back for many years to get that back. At first, Africans in America were subject to the same laws as Europeans here, but the need for cheap labor took over. And slavery, of course, the ownership or forced labor of one people by another became more accepted, and rights of blacks were stripped. In 1640, Maryland denied blacks the right to bear arms. In 1680, free blacks could not own property, which was the only political power that was recognized. I mean, slavery can only work if slaves are dependent, defenseless, and afraid to escape. It was a sad reality. So the split from England, the relationship of colonial America and England that bound them together, was accepted as normal. Americans were obligated to make England their primary trading partner, and all goods passed through England where they were taxed. Some of the benefits of this were that they got the financial support of British corporations, they had the military defense, they had secure markets for their agricultural products. This generally outweighed the burdens of this obligation. Colonists, though, began to develop this identity as American and not English transplants anymore, and they started thinking of this British presence as intrusive. They tried to fix this instead of ending it. In the French and Indian War resulted in France's expulsion from the New World. This put the British deeply in debt, and they turned to the colonies to help pay for their defense. They started levying taxes on the colonies, and they tried to enforce more than trade laws to increase British profits from American resources. But colonies were free of Spanish, French, and Indian threat at this point, and they thought they didn't need British protection anymore, and they could afford to resist the British efforts to make them pay for it. The Tea Act of 1773 was passed after there were 342 chests of tea hurled into Boston Harbor in the infamous Boston Tea Party. Britain responded by passing the Coercive Acts of 1774, designed to punish these citizens. But these unknowingly sowed seeds of revolution. Philosophical ideas were flourishing in England and the European Enlightenment as a whole, John Locke, but this was also flourishing in America. Colonists rejected British sovereign law, which established the rule of law and constitutional as Parliament as their constitutional principles. They rejected this in favor of popular sovereignty. Colonists thought that government belonged in the hands of the people, and that British colonial authority seemed illegitimate to colonial elite, like taxation without representation. Though British had offered Americans representation in Parliament, but they rejected it in the assemblies of South Carolina and Virginia. But it wasn't just taxation that was objectionable. It was British authority itself. Popular sovereignty is the concept that citizens are the ultimate source of political power. After the Boston Tea Party, it was apparent that Americans were not giving up. In 1774, they founded the First Continental Congress. They declared the Coercive Acts void and planned to stop trade with England. They called for another meeting the next year, but before the meeting, the King's Arm arrested Sam Adams and John Hancock, and they discovered weapons. Paul Revere roused the first shots at Lexington and Concord, and the Revolution began. Story passed by word of mouth and not by social media. How about that? This could be controlled easily because it was passed by word of mouth. And so people who stood to gain the most were those with property, and they were translating it, and most others couldn't read, so the narrative was pretty easy to control. I know some of you guys have told me you're taking a history class that's going through a lot of similar things right now, so I hope that this is interesting that we're talking about it in both contexts. We'll divide a little more later on, but we're just establishing kind of a baseline for things right now. So in 1776, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. It persuaded many Americans to support the revolutionary cause. It went viral at the time, sold more than 150,000 copies in a few weeks, and it called for the rejection of the king, for independence, for the Republican government. In 1776, the Continental Congress met, and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence from England. Jefferson was brilliant, and this document is proof. It's the political document that dissolved the colonial ties between the United States and Britain. John Locke said that a government is based on a contract between the rulers and the ruled. The ruled agreed to obey the laws as long as the rulers protect their basic rights to life, liberty, and property. If this fails, they can break up and form a new government, which is exactly what the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says, except for Thomas Jefferson changed life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so he could get more people on board. He was trying to show that Britain had broken this contract and violated the colonists' rights. There were 27 paragraphs of Jefferson telling the colonists how badly King George had treated them. But they didn't point fingers at Parliament because they did share, but even though they did share some sort of blame, perhaps because they were going to form a Parliament of their own, or perhaps they didn't recognize Parliament's authority over them. So King George got the wrath. For those of you who have seen Hamilton, King George is my favorite. He's hilarious in that. But it gives you a lot of background of what's going on at the time, right? Do you guys think that there are any circumstances in which it would be justifiable for groups in the United States to rebel against the federal government today? That is such an interesting question to think about in today's world. When I've posed this question in years past, everybody's like, no way. It's really hard to think of a time where it would be justifiable for a group to rebel against the federal government today. However, we saw this earlier this year. The riots at the Capitol on January 6th. I don't know that was justifiable, but they thought it was, certainly. What does it take for something to be justifiable to rebel against our federal government the way that our founders rebelled against their government? John Locke explains that when you say all men are created equal, that doesn't necessarily mean equal, right? Age, virtue, excellency, merit, those can all change the definition of equal. Men are equal in a natural sense, but society establishes dimensions where they're unequal. For example, he did not endorse, but it also did not condemn slavery, much like the founders. Jefferson actually blamed King George for the institution of slavery in the original draft of the Declaration, which is interesting because he owned a lot of slaves. But it was a politically confusing and a morally ambiguous time, and so that passage was eventually deleted. The Articles of Confederation. Okay, so in 1777, the Continental Congress met to create a new government, a constitution, rules that establish a government. In our case, it's written, Britain's is unwritten, and it has endured. France's changes frequently, but it's important that it defines a political body, rules, and institutions for running a government. The Articles of Confederation were the first Constitution of the United States was the Articles of Confederation. It created an association of states with a very weak central government, a firm league of friendship among the 13 states, but didn't empower a central government or act effectively on their behalves. Ultimately, this was replaced because we needed a stronger central government to provide economic and political stability. The Confederation was a government in which independent states unite for common purpose but retain their own sovereignty. States are their own. Central government is only there to run the collective business of the states. That's what they're thinking at this time, right? This is founded on state authority. They say nothing about individuals, no rights or obligations for citizens. This is to be handled by the states. The states were 13 independent units. They had their own currencies, laws, tariffs, and there was no strong central government to unify them. These Articles of Confederation were pretty weak. The future of the United States was up in the air. There was no effective central government, and they couldn't conduct business with other countries. Domestic politics was difficult. Equality was a rallying cry. Popular tyranny is the unrestrained power of the people. In a monarchy, you fear unrestrained power of the king, but in a republican government, you fear the unrestrained power of the people. So in 1787, we have Shays' Rebellion, the grassroots uprising by armed Massachusetts farmers that are protesting foreclosures. Massachusetts had not aided the debt-ridden population so as to keep their land from being foreclosed on. So a mob led by Daniel Shays stormed in a federal army that housed military supplies. This scared and embarrassed the leaders of the United States. It scared their scared them to think that their grand experiment in self-government was failing. And they had to find a way to contain and limit the will of the people in a government that was to be based on the will of the people. So even before Shays, each state had started talking about weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. And they had the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 where they tried to fix the Articles of Confederation, but they didn't want to save it since most of them were elite and being hurt by it. So in the Constitutional Convention, there was an assembly of 55 delegates in the summer of 1787 to recast the Articles of Confederation altogether. The result, of course, was our United States Constitution. It replaced, not revised, the Articles, and some delegates took this to mean that the convention was overthrowing the government. The delegates there were some of the most educated, powerful, and wealthy citizens in the United States. they were impressive delegates, a cream of society who were very well educated when most were not, very wealthy when most were not, mostly young, but politically experienced in revolutionary politics, very well read on political theories of the day. But imagine you are creating your own government from scratch. I've made you guys think about this before. You've got to create all the rules to your liking, but you have other delegates to work with, right? It's not just you thinking of this. There are other things to think about as well. Somebody's going to want a really strong government. Somebody's going to be fearful of big government. We have got to think of a compromise. This compromise here is called federalism. It's a political system where power is divided between central and regional units. Unlike a confederation where states retain the ultimate power, federalism gives the central government a source of its own power, the Constitution, over the people of the United States, but also giving independent power to the states. Federalists are supporters of the Constitution. They are favoring a strong central government, the federal government. Federalists, they want a strong central government. Anti-federalists are advocates of state rights who oppose the Constitution. So now they have to decide how they're going to allot power among the states. Should all states be the same? Should larger ones have more power? Should the small states and the large states have the same amount of power? How should it go? So there were two plans offered to resolve this issue. The Virginia plan was the proposal at the Constitutional Convention that congressional representation be based on population, thus favoring the large states. This was created by James Madison. It proposed the country would have a strong national government run by a bicameral, bi meaning two, cameral meaning house, two house legislature, bicameral legislature, one house directly elected by the people, one indirectly elected by a combination of state legislatures and popularly elected national house. The numbers would be determined by the taxes paid by the residents of the state, which represented the free population of the state. The large states would have more representatives in both houses, and national law would be weighed in their favor. So the Virginia plan, obviously in favor of the large states because Virginia is a large state. The New Jersey plan, New Jersey, obviously small. The proposal at the Constitutional Convention that the congressional representation be equal and thus favoring the small states. It's kind of a reinforcement of the Articles of Confederation, honestly. They wanted a multi-person executive, so not one person could have too much power. And they thought that the constitutional acts would be the supreme law of the land. Obviously, neither of those happened. We have one president, and constitutional acts are not the supreme law of the land. We have a balance of powers. They wanted a unicameral legislature, una meaning one house, and each state would only have one vote. Delegates would be chosen by state legislatures. Small states could block what large states wanted, even though large states had more people and technically were contributing more revenue. How do we deal with this? All right, so they have the Great Compromise. This is the constitutional solution to congressional representation. We have our two chambers. We have the Senate, where we get equal amount of votes by and then we have the House, where we're represented by population. That's why in the Senate, each state gets two senators, and the House is based on population. There are 435 seats, and they're changed every year by the census to determine how many each state gets. So this kept most of the framework of the Virginia plan. We have a strong federal structure headed by a central government with sufficient power to tax citizens, to regulate commerce, to conduct foreign affairs, to organize the military, and to exercise central powers. It called for a single executive, our president, and a national judicial system. It provides for two houses, but the House of Representatives would be based on state population, giving large states the extra clout. But in the Senate, each state had two votes, two senators, which gives smaller states more power in the Senate than the House. The House at this time was going to be elected by the people, and the state would be elected by state legislatures. That was changed, and now we vote the people elect both. The legislation would have to be approved by both houses, so neither large nor small states could hold the entire country hostage. And that's still true. Which actually kind of becomes a problem sometimes when the House passes a piece of legislation and the Senate hasn't passed it, then the Senate passes it and it looks different from what the House passed, and so they have to conference the bill. I spend a lot of time working on this when I'm in Congress, and also now that I'm working as a lobbyist. It's a lot of work to conference a bill to make them look the same, but they do have to look the same. We'll talk about that later on this semester. So now we're also thinking about the North and the South. All right, so slave owners and non-slave owners, they're at odds about how population is going to be determined for purposes of representation in the House. The Southern states wanted to count slaves, even though they have no intention of giving them the right to vote. But the Northerners said that if slaves could not vote, they shouldn't be counted. So the compromise here was the 3/5 compromise. This is the formula for counting 5 slaves as 3 people for purposes of representation, which reconciled Northern and Southern factions of the Constitutional Convention. The word slavery was still never mentioned in the Constitution until it was expressly outlawed in the 13th Amendment in 1865, by the way. That silence implicitly had the effect of allowing slavery to continue. All right, we've had a lot of compromises. Now we've got to ratify this Constitution and get it approved. Another debate now. We've got the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are mostly men with considerable economic stake in the new nation who have fared poorly under the Articles. They are far more aggressive in their media blitz for passing this Constitution. They really like this. They're hitting the New York newspapers with editorials written by Publius, who's Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. These are essays that were bound and distributed, known as the Federalist Papers, which I've had you guys read a few of those already. If you haven't, please look at your syllabus and see if you can read over a few of them. Just Google like Federalist number 10 or whatever it is that I've listed, and just kind of read through them. It's interesting to kind of look at the things they've written. These are a series of essays that were written to build support for the ratification of the Constitution. We still use a lot of what was written in that today to look at the intent of the founders. Anti-Federalists are those who rejected the notion that ambition and corruption were inevitable parts of human nature. If the government could be kept small and local, Americans could be kept happy without getting involved in politics. They thought Americans should never stray from their rural roots, and they could avoid creeping corruption that threatened it. They published essays written under names like Cato, Brutus, and the Federal Farmer. The Federalist Papers, though, were 85 essays. They were well thought out and logical, but tricky and persuasive. So, for example, I just said Federalist number 10. That was where Madison tried to convince Americans that a large country was more likely to succumb to the effects of special interests than a small one, and that the greatest danger came from factions. Factions are groups of citizens united by some common passion or interest and opposed to the rights of other citizens to the interests of the whole community. For example, farmers want to keep the prices of food high, though it would make more Americans worse off. It would make them better off. Businessmen want high import duties, though it would make things more expensive for the rest of us. To control the causes of factions would be to infringe on individual liberty, and Madison thought factions could be easily managed in a large republic because he thought representation would dilute their effects. Madison relied on mechanical elements of politics, size and representation, to remedy a flaw in human nature, the tendency to form divisive factions. This is a typical Federalist approach to government. Do you think we still do this today? In Federalist number 84, this was written by Alexander Hamilton, and the Constitution was ratified because of this, actually argued against a Bill of Rights. Which is a summary of citizen rights guaranteed and protected by a government, which was added to the Constitution as the first 10 amendments in order to achieve ratification. Some state constitutions had a Bill of Rights, and it was argued that they would be redundant. Anti-Federalists were afraid of the invasive power of the national government and were afraid of the submission. Hamilton said it was unnecessary and even dangerous to include them because the limited national government couldn't interfere with citizens' lives in many ways, and any interference would be suspect. If the Constitution were prefaced with a list of things the government could not do to individuals, then the government would assume it had the power to do anything that wasn't expressly forbidden. So, this ended up being more of a bill of limits on the federal government, and they were added as our first 10 amendments. Quickly ratified after that. Smaller states ratified quickly. Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, they ratified quickly. Connecticut and Pennsylvania tipped strongly for Massachusetts, Maryland, and South Carolina. They only had one left for the requisite 9. So you had Virginia, New Hampshire, and then New York. North Carolina eventually defeated it. Rhode Island didn't send any delegates and wouldn't vote, but later North Carolina and Rhode Island did ratify and did join the Union. So there was not just one big elite group at work during the founding. Political and economic leaders acted together to break with England, but then competition was seen. Big states versus small states, northern states versus southern states, merchant elite versus agricultural elite, strong national government versus decentralized power. These compromises that they had to make formed our federal government today. So difficult to think about all those different things they had to go through, but think about the great things that they accomplished. Citizenship was a fledgling creation at our founding. They were not subjects of a crown. Citizens have obligations and rights, but citizenships did not confer equal rights. Principle clash with prejudice. We can be appalled at the failure of founders to practice principles of equality, but we must remember that citizenship was a new concept, and what they created was far more democratic than what they'd seen previously. The purpose of the government is to protect our rights, and the Constitution guarantees Americans' freedoms of speech and assembly. But the government must hold the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in society, or it were to fall, much like the British government fell to American colonies. So we permit legal ways of getting involved: voting, running for office, changing laws, amending the Constitution, hoping to prevent the rise of groups that I talked about earlier, like Cliven Bundy, that promote violence, those that try to overthrow the Capitol on January 6th, the people who are intending to promote political stability, not by revolution. But how do we draw the line between the protection of individual rights and the exercise of governmental authority? We want to respect the rights of all citizens, but this can be thwarted when a small number of individuals reject the rules of the game agreed upon by the majority. So 2 things to think about today. How do you think the federal government should respond to challenges against its legitimacy? Where do we draw the line between sounding off against an elected official and somebody who advocates for violence to protest? And do you think there are any circumstances where it would be justifiable for a group in the United States to rebel against the federal government today? Just think about those. There are some interesting things to ponder as we're going through the rest of this. All right, I'll see you guys back next Tuesday morning. I'm sorry that I skipped this week in the syllabus, but today's lecture is all we have. Please catch up on all of your reading listed in the syllabus. Let me know if you have any questions, and please get everybody get registered on Blackboard and get your textbooks. All right, thanks guys.